Have you ever found yourself unintentionally leaving God out of the process? I know I have, and it hasn't really ever led to anything good. It typically happens when the stress is overwhelming, the sleep is scarce, and it's like I'm just going through the motions. It's like I'm merely surviving. For the last 17 years, I've struggled personally with insomnia, and at countless times when stress was at its peak and the sleep simply wasn't there, I often neglected God in the process. Do I regret this? Absolutely. And it's something that I've had to ask forgiveness for on several different occasions because many of those choices had led down dark roads. You see, when stress and lack of sleep smash together for me, it's just a road of chaos. And if I'm going to be truly honest, it's actually been really hard to involve God in those situations. And the result of those situations has been strained relationships, weak ministry, and a general feeling of despair that's hard to explain. And if any of this sounds familiar to you, then I want you to listen to me for the next couple minutes because Jesus is going to be talking right into our situation. My name is JD, and this is Understanding the Bible. It's where I take small amounts of biblical text and just simply mine the gold out of it. The purpose of doing this is so that your relationship with Jesus would only improve. And if you wouldn't mind, hit that like and subscribe button. It just helps get the message out further. And also, if you want to leave messages in the comments or questions, please put them down there because I love going back and forth with you guys. Now, to set the story up in the previous verses to what we're talking about, Jesus has just taken his three choice disciples, walked up a large mountain, and then was transfigured before them. That means that for a few short moments, Jesus actually put back on the glory that he would normally always wear, but while he was here as a man, he chose to leave that part alone and leave it in heaven. And as this took place, his normal sweaty clothes, his dirty clothes, turned into a dazzling white that no one could ever reproduce here on earth. Not only that, but Moses and Elijah were standing with Jesus having a conversation with him. The disciples said a few things, but it was just kind of like meaningless drivel as they're trying to comprehend what's actually taking place. The next thing that happened was Jesus actually was surrounded by a cloud of glory, and as the cloud parted, Moses and Elijah were gone. But there was a voice that came out of the cloud that said, "Behold, this is my beloved son, listen to him." And what's taking place is the Father is actually speaking to the disciples, and now really to you and me, that Jesus knows what he's doing. This is key because Jesus would soon be executed on a cross as a common criminal, and as we know today, this is the only way to get a sinful people reconciled back to a holy God. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them, and the scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed, and they ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" As Jesus had just come off the mountain where he had revealed his glory to his top three disciples, he comes back down to a problem that's just nothing more than a box of stupid. Jesus had left the 9 other disciples to continue the work, which was casting out demons, healing the sick, and preaching repentance. But as you're going to see, these 9 disciples have hit a roadblock, and the enemy is going to try to capitalize on this problem against Jesus. Now, this argument that's taking place is happening between 3 different groups: the scribes, a great crowd, and the disciples. And my argument is this: anytime religion and a giant crowd is involved, you're like minutes away from a riot. Now, the scribes were the religious PhDs of the day, and they're coming against the disciples, and the disciples are rendered powerless. And the reason the scribes are attacking the disciples here is because the scribes are trying to discredit Jesus' ministry because they are losing power by the day, and Jesus is just gaining in popularity. Now, as Jesus walks down, he's not afraid to walk into the lion's den. He walks straight into the most heated part of the dispute, and he says, "What are you guys arguing about?" Jesus simply isn't afraid. And this is a great observation for us as Christians. We don't need to be afraid to walk into situations like this because Jesus wasn't. And someone in the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." As you can see, this is a huge problem, and the stakes are really high. Imagine being this man, and imagine it's your son that's being violently abused by a spiritual force that you're powerless to do anything against. You find out later that this problem has been happening since childhood, and there's nothing that he could do to stop this demonic attack. This would have been a living hell for the parents and really the whole family. I mean, how many times at dinner had this kid just all of a sudden seized up and foamed at the mouth and ground his teeth? How many times had he been thrown in the fire? How many times had they woken up in the middle of the night to hear nothing but shrieks and screams coming from the child's bedroom? And how many prayers had been offered up to God by this point with not hearing anything in return? Then finally, this guy finally gets the chance to meet up with Jesus' disciples, who are known to be able to cast out demons. But when they come to his son, they're completely unable to do anything about it. And on top of that, the scribes, they're using him as a pawn in this situation for political gain. I think this guy's suffering on at least 3 different levels. 1, the kid has a demon. 2, the disciples were known for having the ability to handle these kind of things. And 3, he's being used as a pawn by the people who should have been pastorally taking care of him, but yet they could care less about him. This guy's living in a state of despair that would be horrible. And what I think for the Father father as this is his lowest point in life. And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I going to be with you? How long am I going to bear with you? Bring him to me." Some might find this situation a little weird because it seems like Jesus gets frustrated, and that's exactly what happens. Jesus is frustrated because everybody is missing the point. And who I think Jesus is talking to here is literally everyone standing there. The disciples have not succeeded in doing what they were given the authority to do. The scribes are, of course, coming after him because of political reasons, and the crowd is starting to riot. This is not a happy place of ministry. Let's just put it that way. However, this doesn't slow Jesus down. And after he says, "You faithless generation," he says, "Bring the boy to me." And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. There's a glaring observation that can often be overlooked, but I want you to see it. In my opinion, this great crowd is on the verge of a riot. The scribes are arguing, and the disciples are just impotent. But look at how the demon responds. As soon as the demon lays eyes on Jesus, he knows exactly who he's talking to. All that chaos was taking place because the demon was allowed to wreak havoc inside that boy. But as soon as the demon saw that it was Jesus standing there, he goes into a full-blown tantrum because he knows really soon that he is going to be expelled by God himself from that boy, and he's going to lose his spot in him forever. And what's interesting here is the demon knew exactly who Jesus was while everyone else was clueless, and the demon was terrified. This would have been a horrible thing to watch because that demon was causing so much chaos in the midst of that whole great crowd. This is the reason why the crowd is almost rioting in the first place. But look at how Jesus responds to the madness. And Jesus asked the Father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. It has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Jesus doesn't go straight to the child. Instead, he asked the Father questions. Don't you think that's weird? I mean, if this is your kid, wouldn't you want Jesus to walk right up to the kid, cast the demon out, and maybe then talk to you? But he doesn't do that. The real problem here is not the demonized child. While that is a problem, the real problem is the lack of belief, or what we'd say is unbelief, by everyone present. And Jesus just asked the Father a very simple question. How long has this been happening? Now remember, just before this riot scene takes place, where was Jesus? He was on top of the mountain where he was talking in his glorified state to Moses and Elijah, who died hundreds of years before, but were very much alive talking with Jesus in that moment. What I'm trying to say is Jesus knows the answer to this question, but you have to ask the question, why does he ask it? It's because Jesus has compassion on this man. He gives this man an opportunity to unload all of the truth that's been happening in this man's life up to this point. I mean, how much pain as a father would you feel if your kid was constantly being thrown into the fire or the water for the purpose of killing him? You see, this guy is finally getting an audience with Jesus, and he's able to explain what's actually going on inside of him, and he's not being used as a pawn. I believe the greatest part of this story is when the man cries out to Jesus, but you have to remember where he is right now. His son is currently being attacked by supernatural forces that he is powerless to defend. The people that he thought could take care of it have let him down, and the religious elite who should be on this man's side, they're only concerned with their political power. So this man is getting rejected on every single level. So when this man says, "if you can," it's because every single experience this guy has had with people that supposedly could help him have failed him miserably. And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." The response Jesus gives to the father seems to be quite harsh because he's calling out the unbelief in him. It's like Jesus is saying, "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? 9 minutes ago, I was up on the mountain talking with Moses and Elijah in my glorified state, and you think that I'm going to have a problem dealing with this pathetic little demon?" But he follows that up with, "Anything is possible for one who believes." And this guy cries out with a prayer to Jesus that's the most honest prayer ever. He says, "I believe, help my unbelief." And some manuscripts even say with tears. So this is a very emotional statement that this guy is making. It's like this guy is just on the verge of breaking down. And what does that prayer even mean? It means somewhere deep down he knew that Jesus was able to do something. But yet every roadblock that shows up for this man, he gets rejected. He brought his child out into the public for help from the disciples. You do not bring your demonized child out into the public knowing that the demon could pop off at any moment, where he'd have to clean up the foam on the kid's mouth and then pick him up and bring him back home. And the point of the story is, up to this point, everybody has failed this father except for Jesus. So the result of this conversation between Jesus and the Father is Jesus is questioning this man's belief, and the man gives everything he can. He says, "I believe, help my unbelief," meaning he's acknowledging his own weakness in the utmost humility and begging Jesus for help at the same time. This is exactly the spot where Jesus wants us. I love this guy because I can totally relate with him. Not sleeping for so many years has actually been really, really hard. So many times I felt like a zombie just simply existing. And there was actually times when it got so bad that I would hallucinate hallucinate. And really, maybe the best way to say it, it was just a giant pile of awful that I could not get out from under. So I completely understand this man when he says, I believe, help my unbelief, because that is exactly where I've been at certain parts of my life. And when Jesus saw the crowd running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, He is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. Whenever you see a crowd running together that's as riled up as this one is, it's usually a recipe for disaster. But Jesus takes control of the situation. He rebukes the evil spirit, never allowing him to return, and in that time, the whole crowd is surrounding Jesus. And the only thing that they can say is, He's dead. Why would they say that? Because one moment he's rolling around on the ground frothing, and then all of a sudden there's no energy left in him, and he actually looks dead. But Jesus then picks him up by the hand, and the kid stood. Now think about how the atmosphere just changed. It went from an almost riot to that of what I think was just simply amazement. The scribes were shamed because Jesus performed the miracle. The great crowd had to leave because there was nothing left for them to see. And the disciples looked stupid because they couldn't do what Jesus had called them and given them the authority to do. Now the father gets his son back demon-free, and we're not told what happened, but I can probably imagine that there was a whole lot of hugs and tearful thankfulness that was going on in that moment. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, Why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. So they get back to the house and they have some private time with Jesus, and they ask him, Why were we not able to cast out the demon? And the answer to their question is actually in their question. Why can't we cast out the demon? It's because the disciples were not relying on the power of God. They were simply going through the motions of ministry because their hearts were not in tune with God. And the result of that was their words held zero power. You see, they took what Jesus had given to them and just took it for granted. And that action caused this huge argument/riot to take place, and it killed almost all of the faith in the one guy who needed help, the father of the demonized boy. Fortunately, Jesus saves the day here, but this is a huge wake-up call for us as Christians who need to be completely reliant on everything from the Lord. Whenever we move into a space and we say, Jesus, I got this, you can sit this one out, that is a scary place to be because it's destined to fail. The message Jesus is giving everybody here is you can do nothing without him. Sure, you could go through the motions, but at the end of the day, all you're doing is speaking empty words and no one's affected. I know I don't want to live that way, and I'm guessing you probably don't either. This means we need to be people of prayer. We need to be talking to Jesus. We need to be listening to what Jesus says to us, and then we need to be carrying it out. And we need this conversation going back and forth on a daily basis. Now, after years of dealing with insomnia, God has finally brought some answers and some breakthrough. But there were so many times when I did things my way and all it did was screw things up. But I tell you what, I have cried out to Jesus. I've cried out to Jesus over and over again, hoping and waiting for an answer. And I can't tell you why it took 17 years. But when I look at this story, I see a father who was dealing with a demonized son for a long time. So sometimes the prayers that we offer up just take a while. Why? Because it's done on Jesus's time frame, not ours. So for me, it took 17 years for that prayer to finally be answered. But I tell you what, it's been answered. And for that, I'm so thankful. Now, if you're struggling, here's my advice. Pray and pray often. Talk to Jesus. Ask him for the courage, the strength, the wisdom, and the help to get through whatever's in front of you. Be like a dog on a bone with your problem before God. Keep bringing it to the Lord until you get an answer. Sometimes these kind of prayers are answered straight away, and for some reason, they take a while. And why do they take a while? That's something that is Jesus's timeline. And what I can tell you is this. We are called to pray, and he's the one that unloads his power onto us when we do. In other words, our job is to pray and listen, and his job is to speak and move in power. Thanks, and I hope this helps.